Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood stories in all of Greek mythology, the tale of a woman whose name has become a warning, a curse, and a mirror. But what if everything we think we know about Medusa is wrong? What if the monster wasn't born from evil, but from betrayal? And what secret did the gods try to bury in the silence of her curse? A secret that would change the meaning of her story forever. This is the complete story of Medusa, a woman turned legend, a victim turned weapon, and a monster who was never truly monstrous. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. To understand Medusa, we first have to understand the world she was born into, a world where gods walked among mortals with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm at a garden party. Ancient Greece was alive with divine presence. Beauty and ambition danced hand in hand, weaving patterns that were as glorious as they were dangerous. The line between blessing and curse was thinner than morning mist. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath endless blue skies, marble temples gleamed against sunlit cliffs, and every grove, every spring, might hide a watching god, ready to bless you or ruin you. The air itself seemed charged, humming with both promise and peril, heavy with the scent of olive blossoms and burnt offerings, a world where faith was both shield and gamble. And into this shimmering, perilous age Medusa was born, not as a monster, but as a maiden of extraordinary beauty. Some say she first opened her eyes in the far west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the sun sinks into an endless sea. Others say she was born in Libya, where the desert and the ocean meet in eternal collision. Her parents, Phorcys and Ceto, were ancient sea deities, creatures of the deep, older than Olympus itself, their blood carrying the cold memory of creation. She had two sisters, Stheno and Euryale, the Gorgons. In the oldest versions, they were all born as monsters, immortal, winged, serpent-haired beings of bronze and gold. But myths change shape like water, and somewhere along the centuries one version whispered a crueler truth, that Medusa alone was mortal, the only human born into an immortal family, the only one who could bleed, the only one who could lose everything. Her beauty was said to rival the dawn, hair like molten gold, or polished ebony depending on the poet telling the tale, eyes that shifted from green to grey to blue, like the sea reflecting its own moods. Her every movement carried grace, as if she danced to divine music only she could hear. In a world where beauty was power, Medusa possessed a dangerous kind of treasure, because when the gods coveted something, they rarely let mortals keep it. She chose, or perhaps was chosen, to serve as a priestess in the temple of Athena, the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom, warfare, and crafts. This was no small commitment in ancient Greece, where religious service demanded absolute dedication and often lifelong vows. Athena's temple on the Acropolis in Athens was one of the most magnificent structures in the Greek world, though various traditions placed Medusa's service in different temples across the Mediterranean. The temple would have been a place of cool shadows and flickering lamplight, where the scent of burning incense mingled with the distinctive smell of olive oil used in sacred lamps. The floors were polished smooth by countless feet, and the walls adorned with offerings from worshippers, bronze tripods, painted pottery, small golden figurines left in hopes of divine favor. As a priestess of Athena, Medusa would have taken vows that included a promise of chastity. Athena herself was a virgin goddess, proud and fierce in her independence, and she expected her priestesses to mirror her own restraint and devotion. The life of a priestess was one of ritual and order, rising before dawn to make the first offerings of the day, tending the sacred flame that must never go out, speaking the proper prayers at the proper times. It was a life that offered purpose and protection, a place of honor in a society where women's choices were often severely limited. For Medusa, it might have seemed like a sanctuary, a place where her beauty could be dedicated to something greater than the casual desires of mortal men. But, as with so many stories in Greek mythology, the sanctuary would prove to be no sanctuary at all. The gods, for all their power and supposed wisdom, had a troubling habit of viewing mortal women as objects for their amusement and desire, a divine prerogative that caused more suffering than perhaps all the monsters in the ancient world combined. And Poseidon, the earth-shaker, the god of the seas and horses and earthquakes, was among the worst offenders. His was a power that could humble nations, split mountains, and drown cities beneath walls of water. He moved through the world with the confidence of one who had never been told no, and the concept of consent seemed to be something that simply didn't apply to gods of his stature, a moral blind spot roughly the size of the Mediterranean itself. Poseidon saw Medusa. Perhaps it was in the temple itself when he came to make an offering or to conduct some divine business. Perhaps he glimpsed her at a festival, moving through crowds with that distinctive grace. However it happened, he wanted her, and for a god of the sea, the wanting and the taking were often the same action. The stories don't give us Medusa's voice in this moment, don't tell us her thoughts or fears. We're left to imagine her terror as the god pursued her, as she fled seeking safety in the one place that should have been inviolable, Athena's own temple. The rape of Medusa by Poseidon happened within the sacred walls of Athena's temple, an act of such profound disrespect to the goddess that it should have brought divine retribution down upon the god of the sea. One would think that violating a priestess in a temple would rank somewhere on the scale of things not to do if you value your immortal existence, but divine politics operated on principles that would make even the most cynical political operative blush. Poseidon was Athena's uncle, one of the three great brothers who had overthrown the Titans and divided the world among themselves. Zeus ruled the sky, Hades the underworld, and Poseidon the seas. This was divine hierarchy at its most entrenched, where power protected power, and the concept of justice for mortals was more of a gentle suggestion than an actual rule. Athena, returning to her temple, found it desecrated. The sacred space had been violated, the sanctity of her domain shattered. And in that moment one might hope for righteous anger directed at the appropriate target, the god who had committed the act. But divine logic has never been particularly concerned with what mortals might consider justice or fairness. Athena could not, or perhaps would not, confront Poseidon directly. He was too powerful, too connected, too much a part of the cosmic order to be challenged over what he would undoubtedly view as a trivial matter. So instead, the goddess turned her wrath upon the victim. Which of the mythological figures do you find most unjustly treated by the gods? For me, it has to be Medusa. The idea that she was punished for being assaulted is perhaps one of the clearest examples of divine injustice in all of mythology. Athena transformed Medusa from a beautiful maiden into a creature of nightmare. Her lovely hair, once her crowning glory, became a writhing mass of venomous serpents that hissed and snapped at the air. Her smooth skin turned scaly and greenish, taking on the appearance of something reptilian and cold. Her hands became clawed, her form twisted into something that inspired horror rather than admiration. And most terrible of all, her eyes. Those beautiful eyes that had once reflected the sea now held a power so devastating that any living creature who met her gaze directly would be instantly transformed into stone. Not dead, some accounts suggest, but aware, trapped forever in a prison of their own petrified flesh. A fate that one might argue was overkill for someone whose only crime was being in the wrong place with an insufficiently powerful protector. Some modern interpreters of the myth have tried to view this transformation as a gift rather than a curse. Athena giving Medusa the power to defend herself, ensuring that no man could ever harm her again. It's a generous reading, one that tries to salvage something from the wreckage of this story. But the ancient sources are quite clear about the nature of this change. It was a punishment, an act of divine anger, a curse that would define the rest of Medusa's existence. The transformation was Athena's way of cleansing her temple of what she saw as pollution, and Medusa became the sacrifice offered to maintain divine order. Exiled from the world of men and gods alike, Medusa fled to the far western edge of the known world. She travelled to a desolate place where rocky islands rose from stormy seas, where the sun struggled to penetrate the perpetual grey mist that hung over everything like a funeral shroud. Some traditions place her lair in Libya, in desert caves where the wind howled through twisted rock formations. Others suggest she found refuge on an island so remote that most mortals had never heard of it, a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin and permeable. The landscape around her new home was harsh and unforgiving. Jagged cliffs rose from churning waters, their faces carved by endless wind and salt spray into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost malevolent. What vegetation existed was twisted and tough, clinging to life in the poor soil with desperate determination. The air tasted of brine and carried the cries of seabirds whose calls sounded almost human in their plaintiveness. This was a place at the edge of the world where hope came to die and monsters found their home. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, who had always been Gorgons, joined her in exile. Immortal and terrible, they stood guard over their transformed sister, their bronze wings catching what little light filtered through the eternal gloom. The three sisters made their home in caverns worn smooth by ancient waters, in chambers where the walls wept with moisture and every sound echoed into infinity. They existed in a twilight world, neither fully part of the realm of the living nor quite belonging to the domains of the dead. It was a lonely existence, cut off from the vibrant world of mortals and gods alike, a permanent banishment for crimes Medusa had never committed. The cave where Medusa made her lair became something of legend among those few who claimed to have seen it and survived. The entrance was said to be guarded by rock formations that resembled frozen screams, and indeed they were. The courtyard before the cave was littered with statues of every description. Warriors in full bronze armor, their shields raised in eternal defense against a threat they could no longer perceive. Merchants who had come seeking legendary treasure, their hands forever reaching for wealth they would never touch. Curious travelers, sailors blown off course, heroes seeking glory, all had met Medusa's gaze and found their final resting place among the stones. Some of these statues retained enough detail that you could see the exact moment of their transformation captured in stone, the widening of eyes, the opening of mouths in screams that would never make a sound. It was a garden of the dead, a monument to Medusa's curse and a warning to all who might approach. Living with the power to turn living beings to stone must have been its own special torment. Imagine never being able to look directly at another creature, never able to meet the eyes of any living thing without destroying it. Even the serpents that made up her hair were part of her curse, their venom deadly, their constant movement a reminder of what she had become. The isolation must have been crushing, a weight that pressed down on her with every passing day. She who had once moved through the world with grace and purpose was now confined to shadows and solitude, feared and hated by all who knew her name. Yet Medusa was not entirely without companionship or purpose in these dark years. The serpents in her hair, while horrifying to behold, became in their own way her constant companions. Each one had its own personality, its own patterns of movement and sound. She learned to read their hissings and movements, to understand when they sensed danger or prey. They were a part of her now, extensions of her transformed body, and she grew accustomed to their weight and their presence. It was an intimacy born of necessity, a relationship unlike anything else in the mythological world. The years passed in her exile. How many, the myths don't say. Time moved differently in that liminal space at the edge of the world, where the mist never lifted and the sun never quite seemed to rise properly. Medusa might have spent decades or even centuries in her cave, growing more isolated, more bitter, more resigned to her fate with each passing season. The world beyond her rocky domain continued to turn. Empires rose and fell, heroes performed their legendary deeds, but none of it touched her. She was removed from the narrative of human progress, frozen ironically in her own way, trapped in the moment of her transformation. But in the halls of Olympus and in the palaces of mortal kings, Medusa's name had not been forgotten. Indeed, the very horror of her curse made her a subject of fascination and fear. Her head, it was said, still retained its power even after being severed from her body, a weapon of such devastating potential that it could turn the tide of any battle, could make kingdoms tremble and heroes pause. And there were those who coveted such power, who saw in Medusa not a tragic figure but an opportunity, a problem to be solved, a monster to be slain for glory and gain. This brings us to Perseus, a hero whose story would become forever intertwined with Medusa's own. Perseus was the son of Zeus, because of course he was, the king of the gods, having scattered his divine offspring across Greece with the enthusiasm of someone playing a very competitive game of chance. His mother was Danae, a princess of Argos who had been locked in a bronze chamber by her father after a prophecy foretold that her son would kill him. Zeus, never one to let a locked door stand in the way of his desires, transformed himself into a shower of golden light and visited Danae in her prison. One might note that divine courtship in Greek mythology had all the subtlety and romance of a natural disaster. Perseus was born in that bronze chamber, and his grandfather, King Acrisius, faced a dilemma. He couldn't kill his daughter and grandson outright, that would bring down the wrath of Zeus, but he also couldn't simply let them go free. So he chose a middle path that was technically not murder but functionally quite close to it. He sealed Danae and the infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, leaving their fate to the waves and the whims of the gods. It was the kind of solution that let him sleep at night while still probably dooming his descendants, a masterclass in technically legal but morally questionable decision-making. But Perseus and his mother did not drown. Their chest washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in. Perseus grew up on this island, raised by his mother and their protector, learning the skills of fishing and seamanship, unaware of his divine heritage or the destiny that awaited him. He was strong and clever, handsome and brave, all the qualities that marked a hero in the making. But he was also poor, without prospects, just another young man trying to make his way in a world that had little use for the ambitious but resourceless. The trouble began, as it so often did in Greek stories, with a king's desire and a woman's unwillingness. Polydectes, the king of Seriphos, had fallen in love with Danae and wanted to marry her. She refused him repeatedly, and Perseus, now grown to young manhood, stood between the king and his mother, a protection she desperately needed. Polydectes needed to remove Perseus from the picture without making a martyr of him or angering Zeus. He needed Perseus gone, and he needed it to seem like Perseus's own choice, his own quest for glory. So Polydectes announced that he was going to marry another woman, a convenient lie, and demanded that all the men of the island bring him gifts worthy of a royal wedding. Horses were the traditional gift, symbols of wealth and status. But Perseus had no horses, no wealth to speak of at all. In the gathering where the gifts were announced, Perseus, perhaps stung by shame or goaded by pride, made a boast that would seal his fate. He declared that he would bring Polydectes any gift he desired, even the head of Medusa herself. It was the kind of impossible boast that young men make when their pride overwhelms their common sense, a phenomenon that has remained remarkably consistent throughout human history. Polydectes, seeing his opportunity, held Perseus to his word. The king accepted the boast, made it binding, and sent the young hero off on what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. No one returned from facing Medusa. The stone statues in her courtyard testified to that. Perseus would venture into the unknown, face the Gorgon, and die far from home, leaving Danae without her protector. It was a perfect plan, the kind of clean solution that kings who lack basic decency find particularly satisfying. But Perseus had something that previous would-be heroes lacked: divine parentage and the favour of gods who took an interest in their half-mortal offspring when it suited them. As Perseus prepared for his journey, uncertain of where to even begin, he received visitors of a decidedly supernatural nature. Athena appeared to him first, the goddess whose temple had been the site of Medusa's transformation. One might wonder about the goddess's motivations here. Was it guilt over her treatment of Medusa? A desire to see her curse carried to its final conclusion, or simply a preference for backing winners in the great game of mortal versus monster? The gods rarely explained their reasoning, and Athena was no exception. The goddess gave Perseus a bronze shield polished to a mirror shine, bright enough to reflect the sun and smooth enough to show a perfect image. She instructed him never to look directly at Medusa, but to use the shield as a mirror, viewing the Gorgon only in reflection. It was a clever solution, typical of Athena's wisdom. Exploiting a loophole in the curse reflection wouldn't trigger the stone gaze. The goddess also told Perseus where to find the Grey Eye, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, passing these organs back and forth as needed. They alone knew the location of the Hesperides, the nymphs of the evening who guarded certain magical items that Perseus would need. Hermes, the messenger god, also came to Perseus's aid. Fleet-footed and silver-tongued, Hermes had his own reasons for wanting to see Medusa's head claimed. Perhaps he simply enjoyed a good adventure, or perhaps he was following Zeus's orders to protect his son. Whatever his reasons, Hermes gave Perseus his own sword, a weapon of divine manufacture, sharp enough to cut through anything, blessed by the gods themselves to never dull or break. It was curved like a sickle, designed for a single perfect strike, the kind of weapon that made myths and ended lives with equal efficiency. Thus armed with divine gifts and divine guidance, Perseus set out on his quest. His first stop was to find the Grey Eye, 3 ancient hags who lived in a cave at the edge of the world, where twilight was eternal and the boundaries between times and places grew confused. Their names were Dino, Enyo, and Pemphredo, and they were sisters to the Gorgons themselves, guardians of secrets and watchers of forbidden paths. They shared a single eye between them, which they passed from hand to hand, each taking turns to see the world in brief intervals. It was a strange existence, even by the standards of Greek mythology. One that suggested cosmic efficiency had been taken to somewhat absurd extremes. Perseus approached their cave with caution, knowing that deception would serve him better than force against these ancient beings. He waited and watched as they passed the eye between them, learning the rhythm of their movements, the brief moment when all 3 were blind as the eye traveled from one withered hand to another. In that instant of transition, Perseus struck. He snatched the eye from the air, claiming it before any of the sisters could secure it in their socket. Suddenly blind, the Grey Eye cried out in confusion and rage, demanding the return of their eye, threatening Perseus with curses and calling upon their powerful sisters for vengeance. But Perseus held firm, bargaining with the ancient hags. He would return their eye only if they told him where to find the Hesperides and the magical items he needed to face Medusa and survive. The Grey Eye, powerless without their sight, had no choice but to comply. They revealed the secret paths to the Garden of the Hesperides, described the landmarks he would need to recognize, and warned him of the trials he would face. Only then did Perseus return their eye, tossing it to them and departing quickly before they could organize any pursuit or revenge. It was not the most honorable way to gain information, perhaps, but in the world of heroes and monsters, survival often trumped courtesy. The Garden of the Hesperides lay at the world's western edge, where the sun descended each evening into the encircling ocean. It was a place of impossible beauty, where golden apples hung from branches that never lost their leaves, where the air shimmered with magic and the ground itself seemed to pulse with life. The Hesperides themselves, Aegle, Erythea, Hesperia, and Arethusa, were nymphs of surpassing grace, daughters of the evening, tenders of the garden that belonged to Hera herself. They moved among the trees like living sunlight, their laughter like music, their presence a reminder that not all supernatural beings were monsters or threats. Perseus approached the garden with respect, explaining his quest and his need. The nymphs listened to his story, saw the divine favor upon him, and agreed to help. They brought forth 3 items that would make his quest possible. The first was a kibisis, a magical leather bag that could hold anything regardless of size or danger, could never be broken or torn, and would keep its contents secure. Into this bag, Perseus would eventually place Medusa's severed head. The second item was a pair of winged sandals, light as air and faster than any bird, that would allow Perseus to fly above the earth and sea, travelling impossible distances in mere hours. The third gift was the Cap of Hades, a helm of darkness that granted its wearer invisibility, allowing them to move unseen even by the gods themselves. Armed now with divine weapons and magical items, Perseus finally had the tools he needed to face Medusa. Hermes accompanied him on the journey to the Gorgon's lair, guiding the young hero across trackless seas and through skies where mortal men had never ventured. They flew west and north, following paths known only to gods, until they reached that desolate place where Medusa and her sisters made their home. The landscape below them grew increasingly barren and hostile, the waters darker, the air colder, the very light seeming to drain away as they approached the edge of the world. They arrived at night, which was fortunate, for the Gorgons slept, if their rest could be called sleep. Medusa lay in the center of their cave, her serpent hair writhing even in rest, her body curled protectively. Her sisters Stheno and Uriel flanked her, their bronze wings folded, their immortal forms radiating a subtle glow that illuminated the darkness. The cave itself was a cathedral of stone, stalactites hanging like frozen tears from the ceiling, the walls bearing the marks of centuries of habitation. And everywhere, in the courtyard and scattered even within the cave itself, were the statues, men and beasts frozen mid-motion, eternal monuments to Medusa's curse. Perseus donned the helm of Hades, vanishing from sight even as he stood mere feet from the sleeping Gorgons. He held Athena's shield before him, angled so he could see Medusa's reflection in its polished surface without looking directly at her. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud enough, he was certain, to wake the monsters. Hermes whispered final instructions: strike true, strike fast, and do not hesitate. The moment for action had arrived, and Perseus knew that he would have only one chance. If he failed, if his blow went astray, or if the sisters woke before he could escape, he would join the stone statues as just another failed hero, another cautionary tale. Think about it. Which method of monster slaying in mythology strikes you as the most clever or resourceful? For me, it has to be Perseus's mirror shield strategy. Using your enemy's power against them through simple reflection is pure problem-solving genius. He stepped forward, invisible and silent, moving between the sleeping immortal sisters toward Medusa. The serpents in her hair stirred slightly, sensing perhaps some disturbance in the air, but they did not wake fully. Perseus raised the curved sword Hermes had given him, positioned himself carefully, and struck. The blade, sharp beyond mortal smithing, passed through Medusa's neck in a single perfect arc. Her head separated from her body in an instant, falling away even as Perseus's hand shot out to catch it by the serpent hair, careful never to meet those dead eyes with his own gaze. But the act of beheading Medusa released something unexpected, something no one had foretold. From her severed neck, as blood or ichor, the divine fluid poured forth. 2 beings sprang into existence. The first was Pegasus, the winged horse, pure white and magnificent, who had been conceived during Poseidon's assault on Medusa when the sea god had taken the form of a stallion. The horse burst forth fully formed, spreading wings that caught the dim light, and immediately took flight, soaring up and out of the cave into the wider world where he would have his own adventures. The second was Chrysaor, the warrior born with a golden sword in hand, who emerged as a fully grown man, fierce and ready for battle. Both were children of Medusa and Poseidon, carried within her transformed body all these years, released only in her death. the birth of Pegasus and Chrysaor woke Medusa's immortal sisters. Stheno and Euryale rose with cries of rage and anguish, seeing their mortal sister slain, her body crumpled on the cave floor. Their bronze wings spread wide, filling the cavern with a terrible sound like metal grinding against metal. Their clawed hands reached for Perseus, their eyes, which thankfully did not carry the stone curse, blazing with fury and grief. But Perseus, still wearing the helm of Hades, remained invisible to them. He thrust Medusa's head quickly into the kibisis, the magical bag sealing shut and containing the terrible gaze, then launched himself into the air with the winged sandals. The Gorgon sisters pursued him, filling the air with their screams and the beating of their bronze wings. They could not see him, but they could sense the disturbance he made, the wake he left in the air. They called upon the winds and the seas to hinder his escape, their voices carrying a grief that was almost human in its depth. They had lost their sister, the only mortal among them, the one they had protected and guarded through her long exile. The loss was profound, made worse by their inability to reach her killer, to exact revenge for her death. Perseus fled across the sea, heading back toward the lands he knew, toward home and safety. The sisters pursued for what felt like hours, but eventually even their immortal stamina had limits, and the distance grew too great. They turned back toward their cave, toward the body of their sister, to mourn in their own way. Perseus continued his journey, exhausted but alive, carrying in his bag one of the most powerful weapons in all the world, the head of Medusa, whose gaze could still turn living things to stone, even in death. His journey back was not without incident. Flying over the coast of Ethiopia, Perseus looked down and saw a sight that demanded his attention. A beautiful woman chained to a rock at the sea's edge offered as a sacrifice. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, and her story was its own tragedy of divine punishment and parental foolishness. Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs, which had angered Poseidon. The god had sent a sea monster, Cetus, to ravage the coast, and the oracle had declared that only by sacrificing Andromeda could the kingdom be saved. So her parents, in an act of either desperate pragmatism or cowardice, depending on your perspective, had chained their daughter to the rock to await the monster. Perseus descended from the sky, landing before Andromeda. He learned her story, saw her fear and resignation, and made her a promise. He would save her if she agreed to marry him. It was not the most romantic proposal in mythological history, being more of a transaction than a courtship, but Andromeda, facing imminent death by sea monster, agreed readily enough. Perseus waited, and when Cetus emerged from the waves, a creature of tentacles and teeth and scales that defied easy description, he drew out the head of Medusa and held it aloft. The monster looked upon the Gorgon's face and instantly transformed into stone, becoming a massive statue that slowly sank beneath the waves, leaving only ripples and foam to mark where it had been. Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains and returned to her parents' palace, where preparations for a wedding feast quickly replaced the funeral arrangements that had been underway. But the celebration was interrupted by Phineus, Andromeda's uncle, who had previously been betrothed to her and now arrived with armed men to claim her by force. He accused Perseus of stealing his bride, of interfering in family matters, of being a foreign upstart with no right to Ethiopian royalty. It was a confrontation that could only end one way, and Perseus, growing perhaps a bit too comfortable with his new weapon, drew out Medusa's head once more. Phineus and his men turned to stone mid-charge, frozen forever in their moment of aggression, adding to the growing collection of statues that seemed to follow Perseus wherever he went. With Andromeda now truly his wife, Perseus returned to Seriphos, to the island where his mother waited and where King Polydectes had sent him on what was meant to be a fatal quest. He arrived to find that in his absence, Polydectes had not given up his pursuit of Danae. The king had pursued Perseus's mother relentlessly, and she had been forced to seek sanctuary in a temple with Dictys, the fisherman who had first saved her and Perseus years before. Polydectes had claimed that Perseus must be dead, that no one could survive facing Medusa, and had used this supposed death to pressure Danae even more aggressively. Perseus went directly to the king's palace, walking into a feast where Polydectes sat surrounded by his supporters and allies. The king looked up in shock at Perseus's arrival, clearly not having expected to ever see the young hero again. Perseus announced that he had returned with the gift he had promised, and before Polydectes could react, before anyone could look away, Perseus held aloft the head of Medusa. The king and all his assembled courtiers looked upon the Gorgon's face and turned to stone, becoming statues that would serve as a permanent reminder of the price of treachery and the foolishness of sending heroes on quests they're actually capable of completing. Perseus then gave the kingdom to Dictys, the kind fisherman who had protected his mother in his absence, a reward for years of loyalty and compassion. He finally had Medusa's head properly secured and covered, no longer needing it as a weapon now that his immediate enemies were dealt with. The question remained, what to do with such a powerful and dangerous artifact? It could not simply be destroyed, and keeping it risked future accidents or theft. The head retained its power, the serpents in its hair still moving, the eyes still capable of turning any living thing to stone with a single glance. Perseus travelled to Athena's temple, the goddess who had first aided him in his quest. He offered the head to her as a gift, returning the power that had originated in her curse to her keeping. Athena accepted the offering with satisfaction and attached the head of Medusa to her aegis, the magical shield or breastplate she wore into battle. From that moment forward, Medusa's face adorned Athena's armor, serving as both protection and weapon. Enemies who faced the goddess in battle would see the Gorgon's face and freeze, turning to stone on the battlefield. It was the final fate of Medusa, to become a permanent fixture of war, her image used to strike fear into the hearts of warriors, her power wielded by the very goddess who had cursed her in the first place. There's a certain cyclical poetry to it, though whether Medusa herself would have appreciated the irony is a question we'll never be able to answer. But the power of Medusa's blood extended even beyond her petrifying gaze. The blood that had spilled from her neck when Perseus beheaded her had special properties that would shape future myths and adventures. The blood from the veins on her left side was a deadly poison, capable of killing any living creature in moments, bringing death that was swift and agonizing. But the blood from the right side of her body held the opposite quality. It was a cure-all, capable of healing any injury, curing any disease, even bringing the dead back to life. It was a final duality in Medusa's nature, a reflection of the dual nature of her existence, both monster and victim, both curse and blessing. Athena collected some of this blood and gave it to Asclepius, the greatest healer in Greek mythology. Asclepius was a physician of such extraordinary skill that his knowledge bordered on the divine. He could cure diseases that other healers declared hopeless, could mend injuries that should have been fatal, and with Medusa's blood, his powers grew even greater. He began not just healing the sick, but raising the dead, pulling souls back from the underworld and restoring them to life. It was an act that defied the natural order, that threatened the fundamental boundary between life and death. This did not please the gods, particularly Hades, who saw his realm being emptied of souls. If death itself could be overcome, what would become of the afterlife? What would happen to the cosmic balance? Zeus, heeding Hades's complaints and perhaps concerned about the implications of mortality becoming optional, struck down Asclepius with a thunderbolt. The healer died for his hubris, for daring to make himself equal to the gods by conquering death. Yet even in death, his story ensured Medusa's legacy continued. Her blood had enabled miracles and prompted divine intervention, her power shaping the world even after her demise. The image of Medusa also took on a life of its own in the ancient world, becoming one of the most recognizable and widely used symbols in Greek culture. Her face appeared everywhere, on shields and armor certainly, where it served an apotropaic function meant to ward off evil and frighten enemies. but it also appeared on buildings carved into stone above doorways to protect households. It was woven into textiles, cast in metal, painted on pottery. The Gorgonian, as the image of Medusa's face was called, became a symbol of protection, a talisman against harm. People wore it as jewelry, placed it in their homes, carried it with them. The woman who had been punished and transformed into a monster became, in a strange twist, a guardian figure. Her terrifying visage used to keep danger at bay. Temples across Greece incorporated Gorgon imagery into their architecture. The most famous example was perhaps the Temple of Artemis at Corfu, where a massive Gorgon pediment dominated the structure. Medusa's face carved large and fierce, her serpent hair spreading across the stone, her children Pegasus and Chrysaor flanking her. It was a representation of power and protection, a visual statement that this sacred space was guarded by forces that could turn threats to stone. Other temples followed similar patterns, making Medusa's image as common in sacred architecture as the gods themselves. The Romans, when they later adopted Greek mythology, were equally fascinated by Medusa. Her image appeared on Roman armor, particularly on the breastplates of emperors and generals. It became associated with military might and divine protection. The Emperor Hadrian was particularly fond of Medusa imagery, incorporating it into buildings and monuments throughout the empire. Roman poets and writers retold her story, adding their own interpretations and flourishes. Ovid's version of the tale, written in his Metamorphoses, emphasized the tragedy of Medusa's transformation, painting her as a victim of divine cruelty rather than a monster deserving of death. It was a perspective that added depth to the myth, encouraging readers to see the humanity beneath the horror. In the centuries since ancient times, Medusa's story has continued to evolve and resonate. She has become a figure of feminist interpretation, seen as a symbol of female rage and power, of a woman punished for being victimized, whose very gaze becomes a weapon against those who would objectify or harm her. Artists have reinterpreted her image countless times, sometimes emphasizing her monstrosity, sometimes her beauty, sometimes the tragedy of her transformation. She appears in paintings, sculptures, literature, and modern media, each generation finding something new in her story, some aspect that speaks to contemporary concerns and questions. The psychological interpretation of Medusa has also proven rich ground for analysis. She represents the fear of the feminine, the terror of the castrating mother figure. Her snake hair reminiscent of phallic symbols, her petrifying gaze, a representation of male anxiety about female power and sexuality. She is the dark mirror of beauty, the reminder that attraction and danger often come intertwined. She is the monster made from a maiden, the punishment that becomes the punished, the victim who becomes the aggressor. Each interpretation adds another layer to her myth, making her one of the most complex and multifaceted figures in all of mythology. What aspect of Medusa's myth do you find most compelling or thought-provoking? For me, it has to be the transformation of her image into a protective symbol. The idea that something meant to terrify became something people used to feel safe is a fascinating cultural evolution. Consider the difference between how Medusa is portrayed in ancient Greek art versus later Roman and Renaissance interpretations. In earlier Greek art, she was often depicted as truly monstrous, with boar tusks, a protruding tongue, a wide, grimacing face that was more beast than woman. She was meant to be terrifying, to repel and frighten. But, as time passed, particularly in Roman and later European art, her features became more human, more beautiful. Artists began depicting her as she had been before her transformation, focusing on the tragedy of her curse rather than just its horror. Caravaggio's famous painting shows a Medusa with a beautiful face frozen in an expression of shock and pain, her snake hair writhing around features that are recognizably human, recognizably female. This evolution in how she's portrayed reflects changing attitudes toward her story. As cultures moved away from seeing her purely as a monster to be defeated, they began to recognize the injustice of her fate. She became less a simple antagonist and more a tragic figure whose story prompted questions about justice, punishment, and the nature of victimhood. The fact that she was cursed for being assaulted, that her punishment came from the goddess whose temple should have protected her, that she spent years in exile for crimes committed against her rather than by her. These elements have taken on greater significance in modern interpretations. The serpents in her hair carry their own symbolic weight. In many cultures, snakes represent transformation and rebirth, shedding their skin to emerge renewed, but they also represent danger, poison, death. They are creatures that inspire primal fear in many humans, their sinuous movement and venomous bite making them perfect symbols of threat. In Medusa's case, the serpents replaced her beautiful hair, transforming her crowning glory into a nest of living weapons. They were both her curse and her power, both the mark of her punishment and the symbol of her dangerous new nature. The serpents were alive, aware, constantly moving, a reminder that her transformation was complete, that every part of her had been changed from beautiful maiden to deadly monster. The theme of the gaze in Medusa's story is particularly significant. In Greek culture, the gaze held power. The evil eye was a concept taken seriously. The idea that a look could convey harm or curse was widely believed. Medusa's petrifying stare took this concept to its ultimate extreme. Her gaze didn't just harm, it transformed, it ended life by freezing it, creating a state between living and dead. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of being turned to stone, of being trapped in your final moment of terror forever, aware but unable to move, unable to die, unable to do anything but experience an eternal instant of horror. It's a fate that might be worse than simple death, a punishment that extends beyond the grave. Perseus's use of the reflective shield to defeat Medusa speaks to the power of indirect approach, of using cleverness over brute force. Many heroes in Greek mythology relied on their strength and courage to overcome challenges, but Perseus succeeded through strategy and divine aid. He didn't face Medusa directly. He couldn't, so he found another way, using reflection to see without being seen in return. It's a lesson about the importance of flexibility in problem solving, about finding creative solutions when direct approaches would fail. The fact that this strategy was suggested by Athena, the goddess of wisdom, reinforces the idea that intelligence and cunning are as valuable as physical prowess in overcoming impossible challenges. The birth of Pegasus from Medusa's blood adds another layer of complexity to her story. Something beautiful and good came from her death, a creature that would go on to have its own adventures, to serve other heroes, to become a symbol of inspiration and poetic flight. Pegasus was born from violence and tragedy, but he transcended those origins to become something purely positive in Greek mythology. He would later be captured by Bellerophon and help that hero defeat the Chimera. He would carry Zeus's thunderbolts across the sky. He would eventually be placed among the stars as a constellation, immortalized in the heavens. That such a creature could come from Medusa's death suggests that even the darkest stories can produce light, that transformation, even violent transformation, can lead to unexpected beauty. Chrysaor, the golden warrior born alongside Pegasus, had a different fate. His stories are less well known, his adventures less celebrated, but he too was a product of Medusa and Poseidon. He would go on to father his own line, including Geryon, the three-bodied giant who would be killed by Heracles in one of his 12 labors. Thus, Medusa's bloodline continued through both her children, spreading through mythology, touching other stories and other heroes. She became not just a monster to be defeated, but an ancestor, a link in the chain of mythological causation. The protection aspect of Medusa's image in ancient culture deserves deeper consideration. The Greeks believed that the image of something terrible could ward off actual terrible things, a concept known as apotropaic magic. By placing Medusa's face on shields, doorways, and temples, they were essentially fighting fear with fear, using her horrifying visage to keep other dangers at bay. It was a form of sympathetic magic, the idea that like repels like, that evil looks upon evil and turns away. Medusa became a guardian in death, her image doing for thousands of people what she could never do in life, protecting them from harm. This transformation of meaning is one of the most fascinating aspects of mythology. How symbols shift and change over time, how monsters become protectors, how curses become blessings. Medusa, who lived in isolation and fear, whose only human contact came from those who sought to kill her or were turned to stone by her gaze, became after death one of the most recognized and widely used protective symbols in ancient Greece. There's an irony there that even our dry observer would have to appreciate. The woman who was cursed to be forever alone became, in image form, a constant presence in Greek life, appearing everywhere, recognized by everyone, her face more famous than that of many heroes. Think about the statues that surrounded Medusa's lair. Each one was a person with their own story, their own reasons for seeking out the Gorgon. Some were heroes like Perseus, seeking glory and renown. Others might have been treasure hunters, hoping to find wealth in Medusa's cave. Still others could have been genuinely misguided souls who simply got lost and stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. Each statue represented a life interrupted, a story ended mid-sentence. They stood in eternal testament to Medusa's power, but also to her isolation, surrounding her with frozen companions who could never provide actual companionship, who were reminders of what she had become rather than friends or allies. It was a lonely existence made more so by being surrounded by the petrified remains of those who had sought her out. The blood from Medusa's body having such different properties depending on which side it came from is another example of her dual nature. She was simultaneously poison and cure, death and life, curse and blessing. This duality runs through her entire story. Beautiful maiden and terrifying monster, victim and aggressor, pitiable and frightening. She contained multitudes, embodied contradictions, existed in a liminal space between categories. This makes her a perfect mythological figure because mythology often deals in such contradictions, in the spaces between clear definitions, in the grey areas that make us uncomfortable, precisely because they resist simple interpretation. When we consider Medusa's story in its totality, what emerges is a narrative about the consequences of divine power exercised without restraint, about punishment that far exceeds any possible crime, about transformation both literal and metaphorical. Her story asks uncomfortable questions about justice. What kind of justice system punishes the victim for the crime committed against them? What does it say about divine wisdom when the wise goddess cannot or will not challenge the powerful god who desecrates her temple? What does it mean when the only solution to violation is to transform the violated into something no one else would want to violate again? These questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why Medusa's story continues to fascinate and disturb in equal measure. She is a mirror that reflects back our own discomfort with injustice, our own struggles with the unfair distribution of power and punishment. She is every person who was punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, every victim who became a villain in someone else's narrative, every woman whose beauty became a curse rather than a blessing. The fact that Perseus is celebrated as a hero for killing her, that his deed is considered one of the great achievements of mythological heroism, adds yet another uncomfortable layer. From one perspective, he saved his mother and won his bride by his courage and cleverness. From another, he killed an exile who had been living in isolation, harming no one who didn't actively seek her out, and he did so for personal gain. The statues in her courtyard were warriors and adventurers who came to her lair intentionally, seeking glory or treasure. She didn't hunt humans, they hunted her. Yet Perseus receives the crown of heroism while Medusa remains the monster. It's a stark reminder that mythology, like history, is written by the victors, and the definition of monster often depends entirely on whose perspective is being centered. Which mythological hero's actions do you think are most morally questionable when examined closely? For me, it has to be several of Perseus's actions. While clever, the idea of stealing the Grey-Eye's eye through deception and killing Medusa in her sleep raises some ethical questions about heroic conduct. But perhaps this is exactly the point of mythology, not to provide easy answers or clear moral guidance, but to present us with stories complex enough to provoke thought and debate. Medusa's tale doesn't resolve neatly. It doesn't end with a moral that makes everything clear and comfortable. Instead, it leaves us with questions, with discomfort, with the realization that ancient stories can still cut deep when we really examine them. The legacy of Medusa in modern culture shows no signs of fading. She appears in movies, books, television shows, and video games. She's been reimagined as a superhero, a villain, a misunderstood anti-heroine. Each interpretation brings something new to her story, while keeping the core elements that make her recognizable: the serpent hair, the petrifying gaze, the tragedy of her origins. She has transcended her original myth to become an archetype, a symbol, a character that can be endlessly reinterpreted to suit different contexts and different messages. In feminist literature and criticism, Medusa has become a symbol of female rage and power. Her transformation from victim to threat is read as a metaphor for women taking control of their own narrative, for refusing to remain passive in the face of violence. Her petrifying gaze becomes an act of self-defense, a way of fighting back against a world that would objectify and harm her. Writers like Hélène Cixous have reclaimed Medusa as a figure of female liberation, arguing that we must laugh with Medusa rather than fear her, that her monstrous transformation represents the power women can claim when they refuse to be diminished or destroyed by patriarchal violence. In psychological terms, Medusa represents the shadow self, the parts of ourselves we find difficult to acknowledge or accept. She is what happens when trauma transforms us into something we don't recognize, when we become harder and more dangerous to protect ourselves from further harm. Her story can be read as an exploration of how victimization can change a person, how defensive mechanisms meant to protect us can also isolate us, how the walls we build to keep others out can become prisons we can't escape. Yet within this dark psychological reading, there's also hope. Medusa's power, born from her curse, still had the capacity to heal. Medusa's legacy means that, long after her body was discarded and her head became a trophy, the world continued to wrestle with the meanings and questions her story raised. Even scientific and medical texts of the ancient world referenced Medusa, citing her blood as both a deadly poison and a universal cure. Scholars debated the possible reality behind these magical properties, imagining all manner of rare plants or secret substances as the real-world source, never fully accepting that perhaps the true power lay in the metaphor. Medusa's dual nature, simultaneously healing and destructive, reflected the ambivalence with which ancient cultures regarded power, especially feminine power. Her likeness, the Gorgonian, endured for centuries past the fall of the Greek city-states. When the Byzantines built fortresses in the later Roman world and medieval artisans carved faces into the stonework of Christian architecture, echoes of Medusa's wrathful beauty and protective gaze lingered, often unconsciously. There's a dry irony in protective symbols outliving both their original purpose and their original meaning, proof that cultural memory can be more persistent than logic. In the Renaissance, artists and philosophers rediscovered her myth, finding once again in Medusa the sort of tragic beauty that haunts both dreams and waking moments. Caravaggio, as mentioned earlier, painted her face with the horror of death and the immediate knowledge of betrayal. A human face, no longer simply monstrous, twisted in agony that transcended her serpents. The Enlightenment and later centuries saw Medusa interpreted as a warning, the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of beauty when it becomes a magnet for every passing deity's whims. people found in her rage and isolation an uncomfortable mirror. In psychology, Medusa was adopted as a symbol of the terrifying mother, a Jungian archetype that embodies the power and peril of femininity misunderstood or misused. The story persists today, often repurposed but rarely forgotten. In fashion, the House of Versace chose Medusa's head as its logo, a claim to transformative beauty and irresistible allure. The myth appears in everything from pop culture and fantasy novels to feminist essays and viral social media threads. She is still here, her snakes perhaps digital now, her gaze a meme or a metaphor, but her relevance undiminished. Sometimes, it seems, monsters never truly die, they just change form. What do you think is the most enduring reason Medusa has survived in popular imagination for so many centuries? For me, it's the tension between victimhood and agency. Medusa is punished, isolated, transformed, but she is also powerful, unforgettable, impossible to fully destroy. Returning to the heart of Medusa's story, we remember her as both a woman and a monster, a figure whose fate was dictated not by her own choices, but by the whims of gods and the cruelties of mortals. In her transformation, she becomes an outsider to every world, cast out by God and man, feared and sought out for reasons she cannot control. Even in her death, her power lingers in those who use her image or her blood, whether to kill, to heal, or simply to protect. There is something curiously silent about Medusa's exile that often slips between the lines of myth. When we picture the Gorgon's lair, we tend to focus on its terrors, monstrous forms, petrified men, and the chill that settles in the bones of anyone brave or foolish enough to approach. But imagine, for a little while, the small moments that filled Medusa's endless days. Waking not to the laughter of her sisters, but to the distant crash of tide against the rocks. The cave, always cool, glistened with moisture. High above, sunlight sometimes chanced through a jagged opening, painting shifting patterns upon the stone floor. The air was scented with seaweed, minerals, and the metallic tang of old blood, nature's own incense, perfuming a sanctuary no worshipper would enter willingly. The snakes, let's not forget the snakes, formed her constant company. On stormy days they'd grow restless, hissing and coiling tighter, each one responding in its own peculiar way to Medusa's moods. She came to recognize them as individuals, one surprisingly gentle, another quick to snap, a third forever yawning as if perpetually bored by their shared existence. There's wit in the thought. A monster's hair turning into a council of small, complaining advisors, rumbling against her scalp at every distant thunderclap. Food became a problem never mentioned in poetry. The land around her was barren, but the sea was not. Crabs, eels, and, very occasionally, an unwary bird. She learned to make traps from driftwood, to fish by night, and to cook over small fires always carefully shielded from view. Eating was a solitary act, performed in the company of silent statues, a reminder that even mundane acts can become moments of lingering dread when one is both chef and monster. For all the horror that Medusa inspired in others, much of her existence was ironically mundane. Washing in cold water, finding ways to comb her snakes, mending what little clothing she had with sinew thread and bone needles. Monsters, as it turns out, have laundry too. When Perseus's arrival was still years away, when the stories of her monstrousness had not yet become legend, Medusa endured wave after wave of would-be heroes. Sometimes individuals, sometimes groups, they came with weapons, torches, and bravado. Most perished before crossing the threshold, victims of their own overconfidence. Some impossibly tried to talk, fear and horror mixed in equal measure as they realized the truth of her curse. Her voice, when she answered, was soft and undeniably human, yet it did little to change their fate. Which detail of Medusa's daily life most surprises you? For me, it's always been the thought of her quietly cooking, or perhaps trimming her snake hair, mundane acts that make her story feel so much more real amidst a whirlwind of legends. Over the years, Medusa's relationship with her sisters changed as well. Stheno and Euryale, blessed or cursed with immortality, endured through centuries as guardians and companions. Their visits to Medusa's cave became less frequent, their conversations laced with regret, confusion, even love. Sometimes, late at night, the three would sit together by a smouldering fire, their shadows vast and flickering on ancient walls, sharing memories of childhood games beneath the blue sky. Before the curse, before the exile, before they'd become creatures mothers warned their children about at night. Stheno, fierce and unyielding, tried to lift Medusa's spirits with wild stories of distant lands and endless conquests, as if heroism could be shared by osmosis. Euryale, ever more gentle, would bring trinkets plundered from shipwrecks, a comb, a half-broken music box, a scrap of bright cloth. These moments of sisterly care, almost laughably ordinary, formed bright beads in the long necklace of Medusa's dark years. In time, their conversations turned to the fate that awaited them all. Stheno, unable to die, railed at the injustice, while Euryale wept for the world's misunderstanding. But Medusa sometimes felt a lonely peace, an acceptance not of her fate, but of her own persistence. She'd survived rage, gods, curses, storms, and loneliness. Being the only mortal among immortals, she learned, wasn't just a punishment, it was a peculiar privilege. Mortality gave her an intensity of experience her immortal sisters could not fathom. Their centuries blurred and blended, for Medusa, each day mattered acutely. If you could choose, would you want to be mortal but meaningful, or immortal but numb to time? For me, there's something beautiful in knowing every day counts. It's terrifying, yes, but also clarifying. Even Medusa, I suspect, sensed this sometimes. Meanwhile, the world outside grew ever more distant. Voices in Medusa's mind whispered with the wind rumors of gods in new battles, new mortals rising and falling. The statues multiplied, some fresh, with eyes wide in horror, moss not yet gathering in the crooks of their elbows, others older, slowly returning to the earth, their collapse marked only by the soft thump of stone upon sand. She sometimes created names for them, these frozen guests. The young man with the broken spear became Hopeful, and the hunched traveller clutching a satchel was the Merchant. There was an old shield once polished to a golden gleam, now dulled with sea spray and time, resting beside the Sentinel. For Medusa, these were her unwilling companions, silent but steadfast. She'd confess secrets to them, tell stories, even share sardonic observations, like how some heroes wore far more perfume than their reputation could justify. One suspects monsters have always been the best judges of human pretension. Who better to appreciate a plumed helmet, a gleaming breastplate, or the superstitious charms tied to a sword belt? At times, Medusa wondered if any of the gods still cared. In rare moments of anger, she would shout into the darkness, her cries ricocheting through the valleys and out to the sea, only to be swallowed by mist and silence. The gods, she realized, did not send answers, only riddles in the form of new torments, or strangers foolish enough to believe themselves immune to divine irony. And so the centuries passed in this strange, paradoxical peace. Medusa came to know every crack in the cave's walls, every echo and every pattern in the tides. Even the serpents, ever restless, formed a living crown that pulsed and breathed beside her. For all their menace, she came to love them, as one loves scars that prove survival. In the human world, however, her legend grew. Travellers returned with stories of a land where even birds dared not perch, of a woman so fearsome that her gaze could halt the sun, of a monster whose beauty remained, distorted but not erased, beneath a writhing sea of snakes. Some parents threatened their children, "Be careful, or Medusa will come for you." Others left offerings at the boundary stones just in case a goddess was watching, and just in case the monster was not quite as far away as rumour claimed. With every telling, Medusa's myth sharpened. she became at once more terrifying and more tragic. No one, it seemed, was quite sure where victim ended and villain began. A question, incidentally, that has haunted storybooks and legal systems alike ever since. When Perseus set out from Seriphos, news of another hero on the road hardly registered among the gods. Olympus at that time was gripped by its own dramas, feuds, festivals, petty squabbles that would seem, even by modern family standards, spectacularly immature. Yet a few noticed. Athena, always watchful, and Hermes, whose sly amusement at mortals' plights was matched only by his relentless urge to meddle. And so Medusa's fate and Perseus's ambition were set on a collision course by whims as old as time itself, divine irritation, mortal boasting, and the eternal Greek love of competitive storytelling. In the next stretch of this tale, we'll walk in Perseus's sandals, see the strange lands he crossed, and unveil what rarely gets mentioned, the mistakes he narrowly avoided, the fears he felt but never spoke, and the strange comfort he found gazing into a mirror shield that sometimes seemed to reflect not a monster, but himself. Let's continue, dreamers, and see what other truths linger in the shadows of Medusa's legend. As Perseus ventured farther from familiar shores, the world began to change around him, the landscape growing stranger, the air heavier with myth and hidden intent. Each step brought him through towns and valleys marked by the passing footprints of gods and semi-divine creatures. He learned quickly that the difference between heroism and hubris, between courage and foolishness, is often measured in hindsight, usually by whether the hero survives. Crossing olive groves that shimmered in the haze, Perseus encountered those who had lived long in the shadow of legends. Old men recited stories by lamplight, their eyes darting nervously to the horizon when share tales of the Gorgon. Children drew faces in the dust, sometimes with wild hair and huge, staring eyes, sometimes with sad smiles. Somewhere along these quiet roads, Perseus realized that what people feared most was not Medusa herself, but the uncertainty of fate, the knowledge that gods notice mortals only when they wish to make an example. His journey led him to places unmarked on any map, strange crossroads where the air hummed with expectation, hills crowned with wind-bent trees, springs where nymphs whispered advice between splashes. At every turn the world seemed to test him, offering slivers of luck and the constant temptation to turn back. But Perseus pressed forward, guided by the gifts of Athena and Hermes and the unspoken gnawing hope that his quest might serve as more than a simple errand for a manipulative king. Before nightfall, Perseus arrived at the edge of a bleak moor, notorious for its shifting mists and swirling echoes. Here the Greyeye lived, a trio of sisters, ancient as stone, whose shared eye and tooth made them both grotesque and, in their way, oddly pragmatic. Their cave was littered with bits of old armor, dried herbs, and symbols etched in the rock wards against curses, reminders of forgotten grievances. Perseus entered quietly, mindful not to rouse the Greyeye's legendary bad moods. When the eye passed from Dino to Pemfredo, then to Enyo, he saw their faces flicker between awareness and blindness, their voices growing shrill when vision failed them. Stealing their eye, as instructed, required not only slyness but also timing, the sort of moment where the difference between cleverness and theft is simply a matter of who tells the story. Negotiations with the Greyeye were never simple. Details of Perseus's quest were met with cackles, wheezes, and the occasional spit. One sister confessed that in all her centuries she'd never seen a hero succeed without stealing something. Another lamented that mortals always came asking the wrong questions, a dry observation about human inquiry that still feels relevant in boardrooms today. After threats and bargains, Perseus got his directions. The Hesperides, distant and dazzling, waited beyond twilight glens, where their golden apples glowed with unnatural light. With a rueful smile, Perseus tossed back the eye, listening to the Greyeye mutter about the decline of hero etiquette, a classic case of ancient customer service woes. Had you ever bargained for something by giving up the very thing you needed? For me, there's a special kind of irony in persuading someone to help you only after you've made them completely blind to the results. Travelling on, Perseus reached the Garden of the Hesperides. The air shimmered here, sweet with fruit and perfumed with distant salt. The nymphs themselves, dazzling and light-footed, greeted him not with suspicion but with curiosity, the sort reserved for mortals audacious enough to enter the precincts of legend. They provided him the magical bag, the winged sandals, and the cap of Hades, each handed over with a half smile and a warning. Take only what you need, and remember, we judge mortals not by their triumphs, but by what they leave behind. With these gifts, Perseus marveled at his own luck. The sandals fit like a promise, the cap cold and heavy reminded him of the price of invisibility. And the kybaisis, ready for Medusa's head, felt oddly weightless, the way all decisive instruments do before they're tested. Onwards then, over roaring seas and moonlit lands, Perseus approached the Gorgon's lair, a place rumour painted in pure terror, a land where every shadow held warning. The journey from this point forward became a lesson in silence, patience, and nerve. For every tale of heroism told after, few consider the hours of waiting, the sharp bite of fear, or the strange kinship Perseus felt toward the monster he was meant to slay. He arrived at midnight, the world painted only in shades of silver and grey. The cave, so often described as a fortress, felt more like a tomb filled, not just with statues, but with memory. Perseus prepared, checked every detail, and settled his mind. Heroes, he realized, do not rid themselves of fear. They simply learn to act in its presence. With the cap of Hades upon his brow, Perseus became nothing more than a passing chill in the air, a whisper of motion, unseen by all things, except, perhaps, the gods themselves. His eyes stayed locked on the shield's reflection, the world turned backwards, Medusa's form rendered in polished bronze. To look directly would mean oblivion, to look away, failure. Before him, Medusa slept. The snakes shifted and twined, sensing something different in the wind. Perseus's grip tightened on Hermes's blade, a tool made for precision, not spectacle. If poets ever praised the drama of this moment, they neglected its true character, a simple, necessary act, neither glorious nor shameful, but essential for those with destinies decided by others. Yet in that moment Perseus felt something few heroes admit, a kind of sadness for what must be lost. Killing monsters often means killing mysteries, and there is no trophy awarded for understanding. Dreamers, which part of Perseus's journey most fascinates you? For me, it's always been the quiet realization that every hero faces a mirror, sometimes literal, sometimes not, before they complete their greatest challenge. With a single, swift motion, Perseus completed his task. The air grew heavier, the snakes hissed in a last furious coil, and Medusa's eyes closed forever. But the magic unleashed by her death changed the world again. Pegasus, the winged horse, burst forth and soared into the night, while Chrysaor sprang forth with golden sword in hand. In that instant, the balance tipped anew, life and fate reshuffled beneath the watchful shadows of the gods. The immortal sisters cried out, a sound that, to this day, some say travels on storm winds. But Perseus, protected by his gifts, escaped. He clutched the kybaisis, felt the weight of destiny shift in his hand, and set his course homeward. As he moved through the darkness, statues and sorrow behind him, the cave felt empty not only of danger, but of a story that, for better or worse, had ended. What are your thoughts on heroes who win by wit rather than might? For me, stories like Perseus offer hope that cleverness can change the world where brute force cannot. It's comforting, especially for those of us who prefer words to swords. And so, the legend of Medusa changed once more, echoing out across time. Her cave grew silent, the statues slowly surrendering to moss and wind. Her sisters mourned and raged, their laments weaving new spells into the fabric of night, and the world, ever curious, added the tale of Perseus to its growing catalogue of heroics. Perseus's return journey was as restless and unpredictable as any hero's. The winds never seemed to blow in quite the right direction for too long, and the gods, those perennial sponsors of dramatic tension, found subtle ways to meddle, as if the world couldn't bear a story without a little extra chaos. If you've ever fought the feeling that life is secretly a game rigged by unseen directors, you'll appreciate that Perseus's victories were not only in the slaying, but in simply making it back alive. Flying over the glimmering coasts of Africa, Perseus gazed down and saw the sea give birth to strange monsters. Cetus, the beast sent to punish Queen Cassiopeia for her pride, rose from frothy waves, a jaw like a ship's prow, scales that shimmered like hammered bronze, and enough teeth to inspire a sea shanty or two. Perseus, not one for unnecessary risk, brandished Medusa's head, letting its petrifying gaze do the work. Cetus became a monument, sitting just offshore like an accidental art installation, proof that some monsters are conquered by cleverness and luck in equal measure. It was here that Perseus first met Andromeda chained to a rock, her fate decided not by her own choices, but by her parents' questionable approach to problem-solving. There's a certain dry wit in the fact that, even in myths, parents have a knack for turning small misunderstandings into epic disasters. Perseus, swift and direct, offered rescue in exchange for her hand, a proposition that in most cultures is grounds for negotiation. Andromeda, weighing the odds, agreed. The monster was slain, the bargain struck, and Perseus, proud but perhaps not entirely certain about matrimonial logistics, continued his journey with one more life entwined in his story. Their path homeward was marked by celebrations and disputes. At Andromeda's father's court, guests debated the merits of heroism, wedding etiquette, and whether statues made from petrified rivals count toward a dowry. Phineus, the spurned suitor, arrived in a fury, wielding the predictable mix of entitlement and poor timing that tends to result in unfortunate statue collections. One glance at Medusa's head, and Phineus joined the ranks of those remembered not for their bravery, but for their inability to take no for an answer. Which mythological wedding do you find most memorable? Dramatic, romantic, or hilariously unlucky? For me, the Perseus-Andromeda affair wins hands down. Where else do you get monsters, magic weapons, and awkward family politics all in one go? Returning at last to Seriphos, Perseus faced his oldest enemy, King Polydectes. The palace, once a place of plotting and pride, had become estranged from joy. Perseus strode into the hall, Medusa's head concealed, and called out the king for his manipulation and cruelty. Polydectes, surprised but unrepentant, met Perseus's challenge with glib arrogance, a miscalculation given the circumstances. The head was revealed. The king and his supporters became stone. In a single, silent moment, the scales balanced out, and Danae at last found safety. With order restored, Perseus turned his attention to Athena. She accepted Medusa's head with cool satisfaction, affixing it to her aegis and transforming it into an emblem of divine protection, a reminder that, with gods, even a curse can be repurposed into a useful accessory. Athena's aegis would accompany her into battle, the Gorgon's gaze now serving the goddess's aims. Soldiers who glimpsed it froze in place, unable to decide if the terror they felt was superstition or supernatural fact. Yet in this transformation was irony, the tool born of suffering, wielded not by the victim, but the one who had ordered the suffering in the first place. Ancient project management, you could say, at its most poetically practical. Perseus's own fate landed him elsewhere. He returned the magical items, the sandals, the cap, the bag to their divine owners, content to live simply with Andromeda and, occasionally, contemplate the headaches of being a hero whose problems tended to multiply rather than disappear. History remembers his name, but rarely the price he paid for heroism, sleepless nights, uneasy alliances, and the knowledge that happy endings are just pauses between new trials. Medusa's sisters, by now, had retreated deeper into exile. Stheno and Euryale, never truly part of mortal affairs, became shadows on the edge of myth, whispered about by fishermen, blamed for storms, invoked by those who needed to believe dangers lurked where none could actually be seen. Medusa herself, or rather her memory, continued to grow. The site of her death, a cave marked by twisted statues and the cries of immortal sisters, became a place where few dared tread. The stone forms softened and crumbled, their stories lost except to those who looked closely. Moss claimed the shields, lichen mapped out ancient faces, and the world, busy with new legends, left the garden of monsters to its quiet burial. How do you imagine the statues left behind by Medusa's gaze? Do they haunt you, fascinate you, or seem oddly peaceful in their eternal stillness? For me, they're reminders of every moment frozen by fate, a garden not of punishment, but of stories interrupted. The after story of Medusa did not end with her beheading. Pegasus would carry heroes and gods alike, becoming a symbol of inspiration and freedom. Chrysaor, with his golden sword, would become part of new myths, one more thread in the tapestry left by a monster who was never truly monstrous. Athena, for her part, made use of Medusa's head as both weapon and warning. The aegis became a visual shorthand for divine authority, appearing on coins, statues, and temple reliefs. For centuries, artists polished marble and hammered bronze to preserve Medusa's face, capturing the frenzy of snakes, the melancholy of her eyes, and the hint always of power turned tragic. Medusa's legend spread, crossing seas and epochs. The Etruscans picked up her tale, the Romans adopted her as both danger and charm. Medieval crypt keepers invoked her image for protection, and Renaissance artists drew inspiration from both her suffering and her defiance. Long before Perseus arrived in her world, Medusa's solitude became a living thing, an uninvited companion coiling in the corners of her mind. On nights when the wind rattled the cave's mouth, she would sink back against the damp wall and listen, feeling the heartbeat of the earth far below. Sometimes she traced the contours of the cave with her hand, cold, rough stone under her fingertips, wondering whether the world outside had changed, if sunlight somewhere still touched olive trees and ripple fields of wheat. The statues stood sentinel, dozens, and then hundreds as years drew on. On quiet afternoons, the sunlight would sneak cautiously across the cave floor, lingering for a moment on a cheekbone of marble or the tips of stone fingers. Medusa would sometimes sit near the archer, who'd been frozen mid-draw, and tell the silent form what she remembered about singing cicadas in the far-off summer, or how the sea foam glowed like ghosts on stormy nights. It became a ritual to share a single, small story every day with one of the statues, as if she owed this small intimacy to the lost ambitions now crowding her stone garden. Despite her monstrous reputation, Medusa was unwaveringly gentle with the wildlife that braved her domain. She watched owls nest just above the threshold, careful to never meet her eyes, raising young each season in a small hollow only she knew about. In spring, the first green shoots would struggle up through cracks, and she'd go out among them at dusk and let the snakes slither gently through new grass, curious, never harming. At times, passing ships would anchor in the bay below her cliffs. Their torches littered the night with pinpricks of gold. Voices drifted up on the wind, sometimes laughter, sometimes fear, laced songs about the monster who sleeps when the moon is new. She listened, a distant participant in stories that would wash back onto beaches she'd never walk. If you could stand in Medusa's lair for just a minute, what detail do you think would haunt you most? For me, it would be the mixture of old hope and present sorrow embedded in every layer, the mossy armor, the delicate owl calls, the hush that feels both sacred and unspeakably sad. Her sister's visits became both a blessing and a complication. Stheno's anger at the world's blindness was righteous and volcanic. "Let them come," she'd snarl to the salt wind. "Let them see what justice looks like." Uriel, by contrast, soothed with whispered stories and soft hands. Medusa clung to these visits, grateful for love that survived even the gods' attempts to nullify it. Together, they remembered childhood, a time when games consisted of chasing each other along sun-struck shores, contests of who could hold their breath the longest, and weaving ribbons through their hair at festivals. But here, the conversations grew heavier, a tally of those lost, a line of questions about why gods chose mortals for suffering, as if picking stones from a riverbed. The sisters' love was a fierce light against the encroaching dark, and in those moments, Medusa was not just victim nor monster, but sister witness and participant in the shared alchemy of surviving the impossible. Every so often, clouds would part, and strange auroras would flicker. On such nights, Medusa would lie at the cave's mouth and watch the moving sky, the green and violet rivers pulsing in silence. She would remember, despite herself, glimpses of the temple, Athena's marble columns rising against a blue heaven, the hush of prayer under cold stone, the scent of olive oil smoke spiraling up to where the gods, presumably, listened. There's a wry comfort, she reflected, in thinking the gods only listen when mortals are asking for trouble. Otherwise, they seem to leave things blissfully alone. As stories of Medusa's terror spread, the outside world responded as it so often does by naming her the source of every misfortune. Failed harvest? Must be the Gorgon's curse. Sudden fever? Clearly her gaze upon the village. It's a pattern not unfamiliar today. When faced with the inexplicable, people reach for the nearest monster for blame. Medusa understood this, and sometimes, just sometimes, she almost smiled at the predictability of the accusation. Meanwhile, Perseus's journey was a saga of its own. Guided not only by the divine gifts but by his curiosity, he found that the world was more than a backdrop for heroics. When the sandals of Hermes lifted him just above the earth, he marveled at the endless forest canopies, the vein-like rivers threading between mountains. In a marketplace by a moonlit harbour, he shared bread with a woman who became, for one night, his compass, telling tales of the stars and the monsters rumoured to hide in their shapes. Such pauses matter. They are the breaths between the lines of epic. They remind us that the path between monsters holds beauty worth lingering over. What mythical item would you choose for a journey? A shield, a sword, flying sandals, or something else entirely? For me, it's the sandals. The promise of seeing the world from above, even briefly, outweighs every sword's sharpness. As Perseus approached the far western wilderness, the world beneath his winged sandals revealed hidden moods of its own. Distant thunderclouds curled like sleeping lions, and the wind carried the briny tang of the ocean, a salty promise of both freedom and danger. He spent half his hours scanning the horizon for threats, and the other half marveling that anything so beautiful could exist outside the songs of poets. His travels introduced him to the underbelly of myth, those quiet figures who live at the battered edges, far from temples or courts. In a moss-strung grove, an old shepherd brewed tea of bitter leaves, inviting Perseus to sit. The two exchanged few words, but the old man's patient hands spoke volumes of a life lived at the pace of roots growing and rivers changing course. Perseus carried this lesson, that heroism is not always in action, but sometimes in enduring, in caring, in the almost invisible skill of simply continuing. At the recommendation of a river nymph, Perseus sought the blessing of Hecate, the goddess of magic and thresholds. Her altar, a rough stone half buried in wildflowers, stood at a crossroads where no path continued in a straight line. He left a slice of bread, a strand of hair, and an unspoken wish for safe passage. Whether she granted it, he never knew, but the crossroads behind him faded softly into mist, and for once no ghosts tailed his heels. As the cave came into view, Perseus spent an evening among the scrub and rocks, hidden from sight, watching the slow march of clouds across the moon. He thought of his mother, her years of worry, her soft hands smoothing his hair long ago. He wondered whether heroism was ever really a cure for cruelty. Was there atonement to be found in monsters slain, or would the wounds of old injustice simply shift hands, passing on as new forms of loss? Back in the darkness of her lair, Medusa too lay awake, feeling in her bones that change was coming. The snakes in her hair whispered and twisted restlessly, restless as rumors before a storm. She paced the boundaries of her prison, pausing to rest a hand on the shoulder of the dreamer, a statue caught mid-yawn, face tilted up as if watching hidden stars. Medusa confided to her, a careful murmur, "If you dream tonight, let it be of open fields, no monsters, no gods, only the wind." Among the statues, a strange quiet prevailed. The poet, holding a snapped lyre against his chest, had come seeking inspiration from the Gorgon's legend. Now, moss veiled his face, creeping slowly over his eyes, as if nature herself wished to tuck him gently into sleep. The general still gripped his sword even after years of erosion, the pride in his posture undiminished by time. The maiden sat cross-legged on a broken slab, hands cupping phantom wildflowers. She had come for a blessing, protection perhaps, or a miracle, and remained fixed forever at the threshold, not victim nor victor, only a seeker caught by fate. At dusk, the cave was transformed by the low golden light that slid in almost cautiously, illuminating each face, each gesture, as if cataloguing the full panorama of lost possibilities. Medusa, in these hours, pretended she was the priestess again, walking solemnly among the faithful, offering small comforts and blessings to each devotee. If the gods watched these moments, they offered neither scorn nor solace, only the ongoing silence that marked all their most ambiguous interventions. If you could step into Medusa's cave and give a single statue, a general, a poet, a dreamer, or a maiden, the chance to finish their story, who would you choose? For me, it's the poet. There's something hopeful in the notion that music and words might persist, even in stone. Perseus used the time before dawn to study every tool Athena and Hermes had given him. The mirrored shield he polished again and again, careful not to meet his own eyes in the dancing reflections. The sandals he tested, learning how the wind shifted around his ankles in each stride. The sword he weighed in both hands, its balance perfect, its edge so keen it seemed to hum softly when gripped with intent. The cap of Hades he handled with a kind of reverence, its shadow pooling in his palm before he slicked it over his wild hair and practiced walking silently, invisible as thought. He rehearsed the story he would tell upon his return, not just the facts, but the meaning, the why, behind the what. Would he speak of Medusa's humanity? Would he mention the sorrow in her lair, or only the monster that others expected to hear about? Perseus understood, somewhere deep within, that stories are shaped not just by what happens, but by what we choose to remember and what we choose to share. Within her lair, Medusa had begun to sense the thinning of the boundary between past and present. Old memories, long repressed, surfaced unexpectedly. Her first festival as a priestess, the thrill of a new tunic sun, warmed and perfumed with myrrh, the cold flash of Athena's eyes as the world upended, god wrath and shame inextricable. She wondered, when her end came, whether even monsters are greeted by old friends in the dark, or if oblivion was, at last, a return to peace. One stormy evening, the cave echoed with the arrival of another would-be hero. Flash and clamour, bravado stabbed into the rain. He never made it past the outermost statues. Medusa, peering out from the shadows, felt neither bitterness nor triumph, but only a tired understanding that those who seek monsters so eagerly rarely understand their own motives. Her snakes, faithful and ever-present, seemed to agree, curling closer, murmuring comfort in their ancient, secret tongue. You'll sometimes hear mythologists meditate on what became of Medusa's soul. Some say the regret shaped the very rocks of her island, others that she wandered fields of asphodel in the underworld. I like to think she found a moment of rest, a place beyond pain and legend, where she could sit with her sisters in golden dusk, no longer goddess nor monster, but only her truest self. Far from the mortal world, in that shimmering dusk where gorgons and gods drifted outside the map, Medusa's story echoed not only in her own lonely ritual, but also in the minds of those who remembered. For every hero who sought her out, there were merchants and wanderers whose lives were changed by the legend alone. In market squares and winding port alleys, her name was a whispered warning, a promise of danger, and, on rare moonlit nights, a source of wild speculation about what truly lay beneath the monstrous gaze. The statues themselves became silent but potent locators of myth. A traveling scholar, once braving Medusa's island in search of knowledge, catalogued them by type and posture. Years later, he revealed a treatise to his students. Among the Gorgon's crowd stood more dreamers than warriors, more seekers than swordsmen. It was as if the legend of Medusa invited not only boldness, but curiosity, a kind of magnetic challenge for those dissatisfied with ordinary answers. Imagine for a moment the stories that ended in stone. The pilgrim who came to ask the Gorgon for guidance about a crossroads of fate, the painter who'd sworn to capture the truth of her face in oils and charcoal, the herder who prayed for rain for their flock, wandering too near the cave in a moment of distraction. If each statue could speak, the cave would become the world's greatest repository of unfinished dreams. What unfinished story would you want to hear recounted by one of Medusa's statues? For me, it's the pilgrim's. A simple life paused at a single moment of mystery, perhaps holding the greatest insight of all in that absolute stillness. On stormy nights, when lightning danced across the Black Sea and rain battered the cliffs, Medusa would sometimes descend beyond the cave to the shore, her presence barely more than a shifting silhouette against the foam. She would toss pebbles into the surf, watching the moonlight break into scattered silver fragments on the surface. In these stolen moments, she allowed herself to feel almost invisible, concealed from the world's fears, joined only by the distant gulls searching for shelter. The serpents, her constant companions, were no less moved by weather. They'd stretch out languidly after a storm, tasting the salt air, greeting crab and eel in their own peculiar hissing language. Medusa watched their dances with a kind of resigned fondness. Years earlier, she'd despised the transformation, the suffocating living hair, and the isolation it forced upon her. But now, the snakes had become family, each with quirks, moods, and preferences for sunlight or shadow. Sometimes, she mused, monsters are formed not by curses, but by the slow work of acceptance and adaptation. Every cycle, the seasons returned as they always did. Spring painted the cave mouth with shy violets and green moss. Birds threaded new nests in the highest stone crevices. Summer brought heat, the stone warm beneath Medusa's feet, and clouds that scattered like hurried flocks. Autumn meant winds and change, leaves torn from their stems, rain rattling pebbles like tiny drums. Winter drew a hush. The world narrowed to cold sunlight and the bright, thin stars overhead, visible only from the cliff's edge. Which season do you most associate with transformation? Spring's renewal, summer's high joy, autumn's letting go, or winter's quiet reckoning? For me, it's autumn. Change feels honest then, inevitable and poetic. A reminder that even monsters adapt, even heroes feel loss. Within the cave, the arrangement of statues shifted with the season. Moss grew quickly on the moist stone in spring, flowers sometimes anchoring themselves in a soldier's hand or a traveller's cloak. Autumn's winds swept dry, painting everything in delicate browns and golds. Medusa moved among her companions, keeping the garden tidy, as if the care she bestowed could soften the sharp edges of fate. There were myths of outsiders who claimed to have seen Medusa weep. Perhaps a sailor glimpsed her silhouette in a lightning flash, or a child waking on the beach heard her keening to the stars. These fragments fed new stories, tales of a monster who mourned, whose loneliness could turn even the bravest heart to stone with empathy. Further afield, the world kept changing. Poets argued over the details of Medusa's origin. Was she cursed for beauty, punished for a crime, or simply caught between rival gods with too much time on their hands? Artists painted her with snake-crowned brows and aching eyes, sometimes fearsome, sometimes somber. Even temple priests invoked her with mixed intent, admonishing children to avoid pride, envying her power to confront enemies with just a glance. Some philosophers saw Medusa as a metaphor for forbidden knowledge. To look upon the forbidden is to risk ruin, to see truth so stark that the ordinary world can never recover. Others cast her as a warning about unchecked power or misused divinity. She became a figure against which the wise measured their caution, a challenge for the reckless, and, once the dust of centuries had settled, an emblem for those who lived at the edges. If there's a lesson in all these stories, perhaps it's that monsters are remembered not for the harm they cause, but for the questions they leave behind. Medusa, who never asked for her fate, stands as a silent witness to every struggle for understanding, every search for justice that begins with heartbreak and ends with transformation. As Perseus parted from the western edge of the world, the weight of his trial lingered on his shoulders. He understood now, not merely with his mind but in his bones, that stories of victory never account for the true cost. The wind carried him eastward, over fields glazed with morning dew, through valleys where shepherds sang to their flocks, oblivious to the sorrows unfolding at the borders of myth. Each town Perseus passed through seemed to hold its own version of Medusa's curse. In a coastal village, fishermen left tangled nets at the water's edge along with a smattering of small, glittering stones. They believed this would appease the monsters of the deep. In a mountain shrine, a priestess swept the steps with careful deliberation, humming old fragments of prayer that blurred the line between hope and warning. Rituals, Perseus realized, were how mortals made sense of dangers they could not see, how they transformed fear into habit and myth into daily motion. By the time he reunited with Andromeda, Perseus's story had grown, not just in duration but in dimension, no longer just a tale of heroism. It was a tapestry of choices, wounds, and reflections. He took care in each retelling, adding small, honest details, the sadness in a monster's eyes, the loneliness of the wind, the uncertainty that sometimes follows even the most successful deeds. Andromeda listened with the patience of someone who knows that stories are always bigger on the inside. After their marriage, Perseus and Andromeda moved between lands, sometimes welcomed as legends, other times regarded with suspicion. In one city he was honored as the savior of the coast. In another, whispered rumors marked him as the one who brings monsters. He carried Medusa's head carefully, always wrapped in thick cloth, never revealing its power unless necessity forced his hand. It was, for Perseus, a reminder that trophies often bring new burdens, and that possessing danger sometimes means sleeping with watchful caution every night. Danae, Perseus's mother, bore witness to her son's change. She saw the way he paused before windows, gazing into the distant olive groves as if searching for permission to be at peace. Polydectes' downfall brought a kind of raw justice, but also a lingering malaise. Victory, as always, is only half the journey. Perseus wondered whether his mother truly felt safe now, or if she merely carried her fears a little differently than before. Andromeda herself was transformed by the adventure. Once a sacrificial pawn, now a queen alongside Perseus, she adopted the habits of survival, always watching for hints of divine mood swings, teaching her children to respect monsters not only for their danger, but for their reasons. In quiet moments she recounted her own memories of the sea monster Cetus, how the sound of its approach was a low, sorrowful rumble, more like a weeping storm than a beast's roar. Has a moment of hardship ever made you see others, allies, family, even strangers in a new light? For me, Perseus's return reminds me that every struggle creates opportunities for deeper understanding. Sometimes, It isn't the victory itself, but what you share afterwards that matters most. Back on Medusa's Isle, the landscape continued its slow evolution. Statues tumbled, and the elements softened their stern edges. Over time, the moss felt more like a blanket than an intrusion, and wildflowers decorated the stone parade as if honoring the guardians of forgetting. Children from distant lands, grown bold by rumor, sailed near the cliffs to gather Gorgon tears, shining pebbles polished endlessly in the surf, and carried them home as talismans against bad luck. As centuries passed, Medusa's story morphed in the telling. Some claimed she still haunted the dreams of sailors, whispering warnings in the lull between tides. Others insisted she had returned as a guiding spirit for those lost at sea, her snakes now gentle currents guiding ships away from danger. Rumour settled like dust on ancient scrolls, and each new generation found in her legend some new lesson, a reason to mourn injustice, a caution against arrogance, a spark for the imagination of artists and poets alike. The Greeks themselves developed ritual practices around Medusa's memory. In some villages, springtime festivals included dances meant to turn away evil, masked performers twisting and leaping in costumes bristling with painted snakes. Offerings of honey and barley wreaths were placed at crossroads, not for Athena or Zeus, but for the Gorgon herself, a plea not to harm, but to protect. Meanwhile, philosophers debated Medusa's meaning. Later thinkers, like Plato and Aristotle, used her legend as allegory for politics, psychology, and even cosmology. Medusa's gaze became the symbol for moments when truth arrives so suddenly it transforms the watcher, sometimes forever. Medical writers pondered her blood, how one drop destroyed, the other healed, and whether all power in the universe required a shadow, a cost, or a counterweight. Artists embroidered Medusa's image on shields and tapestries. The Gorgonian appeared above city gates and atop household altars, its fierce eyes gleaming to guard storehouses and stables alike. Merchants painted her face on their chests for luck. Young lovers traded snake-shaped trinkets as promises of loyalty and protection. Whether they revered or feared her, the fact remained, Medusa was everywhere, woven into the rhythms of ordinary life, a monster transformed into guardian by sheer persistence of belief. If you wander old ruins today in Greece or southern Italy, you may still find traces, faded stone faces above lintels, patterns of snakes in ancient mosaics. Medusa's legend lingers not only in words or pictures, but in the day-to-day worry over what the world will bring, over what dangers hide in beauty, and over how we can turn the monstrous into the meaningful. As years and civilizations rolled onward, Medusa's face remained more than just a warning on temple stone or a fright beneath flickering lamplight. Her legend travelled with traders, philosophers, and exiles, moving through the Mediterranean like a persistent undertow. Even in lands where olive trees gave way to vineyards or the language shifted from Ionian to Latin, the memory of the Gorgon persisted, complex, mutable, impossible to neatly categorize. Rome, inheriting Greece's mythic treasury, found in Medusa a symbol suited to their own peculiar blend of dread and pride. Her head adorned the armor of centurions, a talisman against chaos in the swirling dust of battle. On coins, her serpent hair shimmered alongside the profiles of emperors, a subtle message for rivals: beware the power hiding in strange places. The Romans, with their appetite for spectacle, promoted both the terror and the triumph, using her image to mark victories over feared enemies, as well as to protect children from the evils of night. Yet for all their bravado, some Roman thinkers developed a softness towards Medusa. Ovid's Metamorphoses gives her a moment of empathy rarely afforded to monsters. He tells her story with tragic detail, lingering over the injustice of her transformation, the violence, the silence, the cruel twist of fate. In these verses, Medusa is not purely to be feared, but mourned. It's a literary pivot that still resonates in modern retellings. Even monsters, it turns out, benefit from a bit of narrative due process. art continued the work, translating Medusa's myth into new forms. In Roman frescoes and mosaics, the Gorgon's face was sometimes beautiful, sometimes melancholy, her snakes stylized and elegant rather than monstrous. Medusa's gaze became less a force of annihilation and more a challenge, an invitation to reflect on beauty and danger, on power and vulnerability. Everyday people saw her not only on weapons, but on jewelry, pottery, even children's toys. By this point, she was as much an emblem of protection as a figure of fear. When the empire fractured and new faiths swept across Europe, Medusa's image did not disappear. Christian clergy, seeking to repurpose old symbols, adapted the Gorgon's fierce visage into gargoyles and stone guardians. Her petrifying stare redirected against evil spirits rather than unwary mortals. In medieval bestiaries, Medusa became an allegory for sin, but the snaky hair and unwavering gaze betrayed an ongoing fascination with the boundary between human and inhuman, sacred and profane. In myths and fairy tales, which monster do you think deserves a second chance? For me, Medusa absolutely demands it. There's something powerfully human in her exile, in the possibility that beneath every curse is a story waiting for understanding and change. The Renaissance remade Medusa anew. Painters like Leonardo and Caravaggio explored the crisis moment of transformation, capturing both terror and beauty in trembling brushstrokes. Sculptors carved her face into fountains and public squares, allowing everyday passers-by to contemplate the emotions flickering across her eyes: fear, pain, irony, and the fleeting memory of a lost childhood. In these faces, Medusa is never flat. She's contradictory, shifting, layered. Her children, Pegasus and Chrysaor, also continued her mythic legacy. Pegasus became a companion to heroes, famously aiding Bellerophon in his battle against the Chimera and later carrying Zeus's thunderbolts in service of order. He was immortalized among the stars, a constellation bright enough to guide sailors across the night sea. Pegasus, the winged horse, embodied freedom and hope, an unexpected gift from the darkness of Medusa's death. Chrysaor, though less celebrated, was a warrior of renown. His golden sword cut through fresh legends. He fathered the three-bodied giant Geryon, who challenged Heracles in the quest for the red cattle. Chrysaor was remembered for force, for strength, for the relentless inheritance of resilience. Interestingly, few myths dwell on whether Pegasus or Chrysaor mourned for their mother. One could argue that myth, for all its detail, sometimes skips the finer emotional truths. Or perhaps the gods, busy with their own intrigues, never permitted the kind of closure mortals crave. But somewhere in the stars, in the marrow of new stories, Medusa's children lived on proof that even the most monstrous origins can give birth to wonder and courage. Over centuries, Medusa's role shifted from villain to muse. She appeared in poetry about longing and exile, inspired allegories on transformation, and offered painters and sculptors a universal challenge: how to capture in a single moment all the grief, power, and inner contradiction of the monstrous and the beautiful. In some traditions, she became the patron of outsiders, those misunderstood, rejected, or transformed by fate. Rebels and artists invoked her name as resistance, seekers of truth claimed her as an ally, and women facing injustice found in her legend both rage and possibility. Throughout time, Medusa's symbolism has refused to be simple. She is at once the destroyer and the guardian, the victim and the victor, the curse and the cure. Her blood gives life and takes it, her gaze petrifies but also protects. She stands at thresholds between mortals and gods, fear and understanding, story and silence. In quiet hours, Medusa is not only myth, but memory, the persistent reminder that fate itself is rarely deserved, and that monsters, like heroes, deserve to be questioned and, sometimes, believed. What quality would you transform into a symbol for your own protection? Wit, kindness, strength, or even a difficult memory? For me, it's wit. there's comfort in knowing that humor makes even sorrow bearable, and sometimes helps us survive what would otherwise be overwhelming. So, as the centuries fade and the bright constellations shift above open seas, the story of Medusa comes full circle. No longer only the monster in the shadows, but the misunderstood girl, the clever survivor, and, perhaps, a distant guide for those who walk the edges of their own worlds. Her face, once feared, is now sought out and reclaimed. In the ink of poets, in painted shields, in whispered dreams, Medusa's image endures for those who need protection and those who wish to remember. For every traveller and artist who finds beauty in what was marked as terrifying, for every listener who hears in the old myths an invitation to rethink what is monstrous and what is precious. Her legend offers reassurance. If there is pain in transformation, there is also wisdom. If there is loneliness in being misunderstood, there is also power in standing apart. And if there is sorrow in endings, there is hope in retelling. Even today, students and dreamers trace her story, sometimes angry, sometimes awed, often discovering that Medusa has become more than any single version could allow. She is at once ever-present and always just beyond reach. You can see her face in the tangled roots of old trees, in the flicker of candle flame at midnight, in the moment before you close your eyes and drift into dreams woven of memory, myth, and gentle surprise. Before you fall asleep tonight, consider what lessons Medusa might whisper if she could speak across the distance of myth and time. What would she say about survival and change, about beauty and fear, about the complicated grace of finding your own place in a world that does not always understand you? My guess is her advice would lean toward humor, shrewdness, and the sort of dry wit born only when someone has seen much and judged little. If the lonely edges of this story have felt familiar to you, let me know in the comments. Where do you most feel a connection with Medusa's journey? For me, it's the late night hours when the world is quiet and even monsters get a chance to rest. With every retelling, new meanings accumulate like layers of moss gathering on ancient stone. There will always be fresh questions about justice, transformation, what it means to protect or destroy, and how we decide who belongs at the center or at the margins. In the end, Medusa's legend is not only about fear, but about what endures after fear, about the possibilities that remain after every curse and every miracle. So, dreamers, thank you for wandering with me through the winding paths and wild places of this myth. We have crossed ancient temples, wind-swept caves, and starlit seas to find the heart of things not easily forgiven or forgotten. And if tonight was a little quieter, a little stranger, or a little more enchanted because of the time we spent in Medusa's world, then perhaps the old stories have done exactly what they are meant to do, bringing us a little closer to rest, a little more curious, and a little kinder. Sleep well, and remember, the monsters you fear and the powers you carry may be closer kin than you ever imagined. Courage and wit are their own talismans. Good night, until next time.